Will your current AM4 motherboard support the third generation of Ryzen processors? Let's find out. So AMD's 7nm Zen 2 Ryzen processors are official and will be released soon. AMD is really giving Intel a hard time considering that they are bringing 16 cores to the mainstream. Now, as great as all of that sounds, will there be the same issue that arose with Zen Plus, where if you had an older board you had to have an updated BIOS? Well, yes. Now, if you have a B450 or X470 board, then all you have to do is just update the BIOS and you should be good to go. And those chipset motherboards will continue to be sold with new BIOS versions pre-flashed, so you can still use X470 and B450 motherboards on Zen 2. But what about the original B350, A320, and X370 chipsets? Now, when Ryzen was released, AMD said that they would support the platform until 2020. Fast forward to 2019 and things aren't looking too great for the older chipsets. Now, AMD of course has a support list for all AM4 motherboards, and as you can see, B450, X470 and above support Zen 2 no problem. And as for the older chipsets, A320 is out of the question. I mean, realistically, you wouldn't be running a 16-core Ryzen CPU in a very low-end motherboard, let alone an 8-core. I mean, I'd assume that if you already have the money to get a high-end CPU, we don't have to compromise on the motherboard. A320's power delivery is pretty trash anyways, so yeah, A320 is not compatible. Now for B350 and X370. Depending on who made your motherboard, so ASUS in my case, you have to release a BIOS update to support Zen 2 just like it was with Zen Plus. But it's quite different this time. The problems with B350 and X370 are that they didn't have PCI Gen 4 in mind, so that's something you miss out on. X570 boards will only support PCIe Gen 4. B350 and X370 boards don't have enough space for the newer BIOS, so the little BIOS chip sitting on the motherboard literally can't hold the ROM file for the new CPUs. That's not saying that motherboard vendors could work around this and find a way to solve that, but there really can't be any guarantee of stability. The next conflict is power delivery. X370 is a higher end chipset in comparison to B350, so it has better power delivery on the VRM assuming the board it's on is any good. But I don't know if you've realized this, but X570 is at the point where it needs a fan to stay at safe temperatures. It has a higher TDP in comparison to previous gen chipsets, so X370 boards should be okay, but as for B350, its power delivery just won't make the cut for these new CPUs. B350 might be able to run an APU or a Ryzen 3, but realistically, unless you have an overkill B350 board with some thick heatsinks, then you might, well, should upgrade to the X470 or B450, or cough up some more cash and go with the X570 chipset. One more thing about X570 that I find interesting is that it doesn't support first gen chips. Probably due to it being limited in some ways, I'm not entirely sure. A good example of this is with Intel's older LGA 2011 socket. X79 was the first chipset. It supported DDR3 memory. As for CPU compatibility, there are some different CPU revisions, or versions as they are classified. The older X79 chipset supported V1 and V2 CPUs. When X99 was released, LGA 2011-3, it had DDR4 support and supported V3 CPUs, as the socket 2011-3 suggests. I don't think there was a V4, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyways, the same thing applies to Intel's more recent LGA 1151 socket, which if I'm not mistaken has been used since the Skylake architecture, and basically the same socket is still being used now. So if you're all about the latest and greatest, having the newest parts, the X570 will be a big investment, but B450 and X470 boards will continue to be sold, though you will lose out on PCIe Gen 4. If you don't necessarily need a 16-core system, they're okay with having an old but not really old board and CPU. You can get an 8-core overclockable Ryzen 7 or a 2nd gen 6-core Ryzen 5, both with hyperthreading. The 1700 or 1700X are still absolute beasts, and you do get hyperthreading, so you do get a total of 16 threads. You will lose out on a little bit of performance, but the amazing value will definitely overshadow that. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or suggestions, let me know in the comment section and I'll do my best to get back to you. Anyways, if you did enjoy the video, hit that like button. While you're there, consider subscribing to the channel and enable notifications for more quality tech videos. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you later.